Hi. Welcome to Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. This is part two of a two-part series on Michelangelo's sculpture. Last time we talked essentially, I guess, about his spiritual evolution through works like the David, the Madonna of the Steps, the Deposition, Rondinini, Pietà, and the Moses. Today we're going to look at the sculpture of the Medici chapel, which he worked on as well as was architect for the chapel itself from about 1524 to 1534, a 10-year period. As somewhat of a disclaimer, I should say, as I mentioned last time, that some of the pictures may be in black and white. Most will be in color, but we'll do the best we can, and some we only have black and white of, and sometimes the black and white will show a little more detail. So nothing's wrong with your set if suddenly something comes up black and white. Michelangelo, as we said, is an extremely complex man. It's very difficult sometimes to separate truth from legend. Some people seem to say that he was extremely jealous of his artistic position, extremely jealous of Leonardo and Raphael, his two great colleagues. And then others report that he was extremely devoted to his friends and very warm-hearted, very caring. Sometimes perhaps his family was overly demanding on him for financial means. Michelangelo, of course, not the poor starving artist in his garret, but considered a god by his contemporaries, the man who outdid the Greeks in their perfection and profound expression of the human body. Whether he was belligerent in his youth, he became a part of the Medici family circle, associating with humanists and philosophers, poets and artists, which no doubt had a great influence on the elevation of his mind and the development of his art. But one story tells of him being very critical of others and criticizing someone's drawing, and that person hauling off and punching him in the nose, breaking his nose, and making it look pretty much like a boxer's proboscis, hooked and somewhat flattened, and he was self-conscious of it the rest of his life. So, is this reality, or is it just an interesting story that perhaps gives some insight into his character? Whatever it was, his character was complex, profound, troubled, very concerned with his spiritual fate and destiny as he reached later age. Now, at the time of 1524, he is about 50 years old, so we're going to be looking at him from the age of 50 to 60 here. If we look at the first picture, we see the interior of the chapel, and we should say that it was intended to be the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, and Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, the great Prince of Art, Prince of Merchant Prince of Florence in the 15th century. His son Giuliano and Lorenzo, his grandson. In this particular shot, we're looking at Giuliano's figure on the left with two allegorical or symbolic nude figures placed below him, and we'll talk about them in a moment. Night is the woman on the left, and Day, the marvelous muscular male figure on the right, forming a triangular composition. Now, the important thing about the setup in the overall chapel is to realize that Giuliano is on one side with two symbolic figures of time, day and night, and on the opposite wall are Lorenzo with his two allegorical figures of dawn and twilight. So we have 4 times of the day. associated with these two figures. Both of the figures turn to look at the Virgin Mary and the Christ child on the third wall of the chapel. So that when we look at them in close-up and we see their figures, their faces turned, they're turned toward the Virgin. And we must assume that part of the very complex symbolism of this work is an ultimate spiritual redemption, which we'll attempt to talk about. We can briefly look at the Virgin, the statue of the Virgin and the Christ child, and we have a sense again of a certain restraint, a certain combined with a kind of tense twisting of the body, which we've seen as an essential Michelangelesque characteristic. There's a lot of tension in his work, a sense of unresolved conflicts or elements that we'll get into with some other works perhaps, but we see it in the Christ child, this kind of spiraling, twisting, as it seeks to, its lower body is turned away from the Virgin, and the upper part of the body has to twist and turn, presumably, well, I guess I was going to say presumably to reach the breast, but the head is above the breast, but to reach, shall we say, the heart of the Virgin, to make a connection with the Virgin, and we could probably see something of Michelangelo's own need for the physical mother, the psychological mother, and for spiritual, ultimate spiritual fulfillment in this, as we mentioned last time, the last program. Here's more of a close-up of Giuliano with Night, the female figure on the left, and Day, the female figure on the right. It's unclear what state of completion this sculptural architectural relationship has, whether the two niches on left and right of Giuliano were meant to be filled with sculptures, were there meant to be other sculptures on the left and right beneath the two nude figures. But taking it as it has been presented and as incorporating some of the thoughts of people who have sought to explore some of the meaning of it, Giuliano was considered the more active figure. Well, we'll get to Lorenzo in a moment, and we'll be able to compare some qualities. But Michelangelo has dressed Giuliano in the garb of a Roman general or some kind of a commander. He holds a baton of leadership in his hand. We will see a detail of it in just a moment of Giuliano. But it's been said that since Giuliano is presumably the more active figure, was more active in his lifetime, that Michelangelo associates with him the more active or the more dramatic parts of the day with Giuliano as reflecting his character. Thus, day is a definite state of time, as night is definite. Dawn and twilight are sort of the nether regions of time, the nether regions of the mind, neither day nor night, transitional periods, which will be associated with Lorenzo, who is more the intellectual, the contemplative, the thinker kind of figure. And we think of the twilight zone of thought, the mist of dreams, and it seems an appropriate connection with the two figures. Day and night are diametrical opposites. Dawn and twilight, I've never really personally been able to really tell the difference between them if I didn't know what time I was looking at them. Let's take a look at Giuliano. Now, it's true that he's dressed in this leadership garb, whether it's the leadership of war or administration. He has that baton of leadership, as we say. There's a certain possibility of action in the figure, as we can see that the legs are placed in such a way, one leg behind the other, that it would be possible to get up, as if there's a possible shifting of weight, although nowhere near as dramatic as his Moses sculpture, which we saw last time, where the figure seems coiled and ready to rise to meet the greatness of God, so to speak, after he has received the tablets and had this face-to-face contact with the divine. But despite all this, there's a certain lethargy in this figure. There's a certain sleepiness in the eyes, a puffiness. The hands, rather than dramatically and dynamically gripping the baton of leadership, seem to lay there in a rather defenseless, weakened gesture. Now, one of the possibilities of these figures is that they are literally being awakened from the dead by looking at the Virgin. We see his face being turned in the direction of the Virgin. We can imagine her sitting off to the right. And that what we're witnessing is kind of a transition from the body to the spirit, kind of a slow awakening to the possibilities of the spirit here. So that there's a contradiction here between active and kind of passiveness here, both in a material and a spiritual way. We can look at the detail of Giuliano's head and see, shot from below, we see an elongation of neck and kind of a questioning look, as if some hypnotic force is being exerted on him, or as if someone is gently snapping a finger saying, Giuliano, awake, awake, Giuliano, this kind of thing. We look at the figure of Day, this tremendous, one of the really great figures of Michelangelo, great because of its massive muscular power, and great because of the relationship of forms and the depth of expressive ideas in it. Interesting to note, despite the fact of great muscular power, there's something constricted about this figure. And when we begin to look at it and think about it, we realize that the upper part of the torso, the arms and shoulders, are turning away from us, while the rear leg, is turning toward us. In other words, he's almost in a pretzel-like contortion where the upper part of the body twists away and the lower part of the body twists toward us. And if he didn't have that massive muscular abdomen, we could imagine him almost being wrung in half like a washcloth or a sponge in a way. We look at the extreme left of the picture and we see Day's left arm around behind his back. See, remember that constricting quality? We'll have a little dance of slides here. In his Madonna of the Steps that we saw last time, the relief sculpture, one of the very earliest pieces Michelangelo does with the babe Christ child in the lap of the mother, and we see the Christ child's right arm around behind the back. It's one of the basic symbols of Michelangelo expressing not unfettered freedom. There's a sense of restriction in his great power, a sense of something holding back as well as something magnificent charging forward. There's an ambivalence in the man that finds expression in sculptures being left unfinished, parts of them smooth, parts of them unfinished, whole projects being left unfinished, as this chapel it was unfinished. So something in process of being, of evolving, of becoming, that is so profound that perhaps it could never totally be finished, in a sense, as perhaps the world of the universe can never totally be finished. It's always in this state of becoming, of moving toward the divine, of ever unfolding, of ever spiraling and opening in this sense, closing and opening. We look at the head of Day, which is quite unfinished, quite roughly carved, compared to the finished smoothness of the shoulder, for example. It's almost like the sun rising over a mountain ridge, the new day trying to be born, and a day that does not want to be born. And one of the theories of this is that the ideas behind it is not only do we see Michelangelo's own conflict, artistic, spiritual, and personal, but the sense of time being slowed or weakened, the effects of time being weakened by the resurrection of Christ, in the sense that the death of matter no longer happens. See, when time slows, when time ceases to function, death doesn't happen. See, because we don't get older, time doesn't pass. And ultimately here the theme of all of these works, probably focusing on the Virgin and Child, is the spiritual redemption through Christ. We take a look as sort of a side trip at Rodin's The Thinker, the great 19th century work, which is seen as an independent figure and also part of his Gates of Hell, which has been on exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum. We see that sense of constriction of the far side of the body coming toward the near side. We see the thinker's right elbow on his left knee. We don't sit like that. If we put our right elbow, if that's what we're using, on our right knee. So he's borrowed a Michelangelesque device to suggest tension, constriction of thought, as 19th century man ponders his fate, in a sense, having lost God, as we become more materialistic, more scientific. And we see this dumb brute that man is, thinking very hard. We see his toes pinching at the stone, gripping in the intensity of his thought, the tendons of his legs ridging in search of answers which he cannot find. The sculpture of night underneath Giuliano is troubled. The night is filled with dreams. The owl lurks under the bent knee. We see that same device again, the rear arm coming forward to the foreground leg, which is exactly what we saw in Rodin here. The constriction is not as much as day, perhaps accounting for the slower time of night. She's weary, head in darkness. The head is shrouded in shadow because it's away from the light. Keep in mind her body, which many writers see as older, the folds of flesh across the torso, the breasts seem somewhat gnarled and used. People speak of her as a woman older in life who has given birth to children. We'll look at her female counterpart under Lorenzo called Dawn, and we'll compare her dewy freshness with the old, worn-out quality of this sculpture in a moment. But what we see, again, we can see time under the control of the spirit. If we wish to, we can see a certain melancholy and reserve that can be part of death, if we want to see night as a time of death. Or we can see it as something reflecting something of Michelangelo's own deeper, darker feeling. Here's Lorenzo on the opposite side of the Medici chapel. Lorenzo the Magnificent's grandson, as we said. And to his left is the figure of Twilight, and to his right, the figure of Dawn. Dawn is seen as a young woman. Dawn is a new time of the day, a fresh time of the day. We'll look at her in detail in a moment. Twilight is the end of the day. He's seen as a weary, older man with possibly still a sense of restriction in him. We'll talk about him in detail when we see his individual reproduction here. Lorenzo, as we said, is the thinker. Let's take a look at him in detail. Hand to chin is the thinking pose. And if we think of him as being contemplative as opposed to Giuliano's active quality, we see Lorenzo, his right hand on his leg, his thigh, turned palm up, the back of it on the thigh. That's not a hand that's immediately going into action. We look at the legs crossed at the ankles. They must be uncrossed in order to step forward, to rise. His head is somewhat in shadow, although it's not extremely deep and apparent here. Maybe it is more in the other one, caused by that hooded helmet that he wears to suggest that he's deep in the shadows of thought, that kind of thing. Whereas Giuliano was more open to the light of day, of activity, hands and feet, if not exactly filled with a great rush of life and vitality, nonetheless has more possibility of it than Lorenzo. In a way, it looks almost, well, we'll skip that thought. It perhaps isn't appropriate. We see a close-up of Lorenzo's head. And of course, he's looking at the Virgin too, you see. He's contemplating her mystery. He's contemplating the meaning of life, of death, and resurrection. And in a sense, I suppose we could say he's being awakened to it as Giuliano was. But it seems that Lorenzo is more the philosopher thinking of these possibilities, more cognizant of them than Giuliano, the man of action, the man we might typify as more gregarious, less thoughtful, being suddenly made aware of these possibilities. Here we look at twilight. And like night, the end of the day, moving toward that end of the day, his body is muscular, but it's softer. It's less tensely strong than day. We see his head old, with the carving roughly unfinished again, settled down into his chest. Again, we'd see, if we could see him from the back, we'd see about the same amount of the upper part of the face as we do on day, rising above that craggy, massive shoulder. We see a slight sense of constriction in the right rear leg passing forward over the left front one, which ties in with night and with day's constriction, but not as extreme, certainly, as day's. The tension seems to have melted. And but there's a sadness. There's a knowing quality. This is someone who has been through life, whatever freshness of youth and hope has been tempered by the realities of life, shall we say. And this figure bears a burden. Now we can say all these allegorical figures can be simply time feeling its own burden of the passage of time and that it brings death, and plus the converse, that death itself is slowed down as time is slowed down, so that ultimate spiritual resurrection can take place. It seems that there are a number of opposite and interlocking possibilities in these works. They're profound sculptures. They're beautifully done technically. They're marvelous studies of human anatomy, but not just anatomy made scientific and rational and academic. It's living anatomy, living bodies. They're living bodies that contain living souls, that represent moral states and states of generalized being, in a sense. They're both ideal and timeless, and yet very specifically human and troubled. They're rich and resonant with psychology and presence of mind and emotion. In other words, they're complete studies of all that human beings can be or wish that they were. They combine the ideal with the real, shall we say. Dawn's a different cup of tea. It seems to me that dawn symbolizes not only the beginning of a new day, but the beginning of a new spiritual day, a new awareness. Unlike all the other figures, she seems to unfold. There's no element of constriction in her. The lower side of her body parallels itself, the arm. We go through the arm, through the thigh, down the leg in a beautiful containing gesture. The back side of the body with the bent arm and leg seem almost like the petals of a flower unfolding to new insight, unfolding to new understanding, unfolding to the new day. So every time a day dawns in reality for us, if we're thoughtful about it, we realize that it's not just an ho-hum, another boring day, another day I have to go to work. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. It symbolizes the beginning of new possibilities of all types. So new insights, new possibilities of spiritual development, new awarenesses, new hopes, new dreams. So, and of course the poet, the artist, thinks of of their work in this way. So that her body is virginal, dewy, fresh, young, unfolding, awakening, and perhaps this ultimately is the crucial figure in the whole Medici chapel grouping. It's the new beginning of life, of insight into spirit. It's truly a resurrection that takes place in the mind and being of the artist and through him in our own lives. So that all of the tension, all of the struggle to be born, that's in day and night and twilight, becomes resolved in this final piece. And so that along with his Rondinini Pietà, which we looked at last time, we see the ultimate artistic, personal, and spiritual fulfillment of this great man, and through him we find our own fulfillment. Amazing work by a great man, and we hope that in our own time artists will begin to attempt to be reborn in their own way, having a more transcendent vision of art and life. Programs Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. It's been nice to have you with us. Bye-bye.